At Mark Dever's prompting, I started a book club to go through the 9 Marks Building Healthy Churches series of 12 books, one a month, with some fellow pastors. So I've been meeting with these brothers, and the first book that we went through was Expositional Preaching, How to Speak God's Word Today by David Helm. I'm Brian Catherman with SaltyBeliever.com, and I'd like to offer a little bit of a review. Now, normally I do book recommendations. Those are a little bit different than a book review. A book review is going to deal with the good and the bad and the ugly and maybe who should read and why, and it's just a little bit different than what I typically do. Yet, I will start by saying I do recommend this book, and I did enjoy it. So let's jump in a little bit. Just for the sake of some background, the book is Expositional Preaching, How to Speak God's Word Today by David Helm. It is published by Crossway. It's part of a 9 Marks series, which is a ministry that you might be familiar with if you've ever read something like What is a Healthy Church, which conveniently is the same size as these books, so they look really nice on your shelf, or The 9 Marks of a Healthy Church. Maybe you've heard some podcasts. The book, this particular one in the series, was published in 2014, and it's actually published by the Charles Simeon Trust. So you might be familiar with that. That's something that David Helm does. It's a preacher's type workshop. This book also, it's important to note, fits within this series of 12 books about building healthy churches. So it really, in a way, isn't a standalone book, although you could read it as a standalone book with no problem, but you really ought to read it with these other books because it fits in context with them. The other books include, I'm missing one of them, Biblical Theology. It's on my nightstand to be read for next month's book study. Sound Doctrine, the Gospel, Conversion, Evangelism, Church Membership, Church Discipline, Church Elders, Discipling, Prayer, Mission. And then, like I said, this is sort of a good overarching introduction, but doesn't actually go in the series. It's called What is a Healthy Church? So if you want to address building healthy churches, you probably ought to know what a healthy church is. So let's talk about the first book in our book club series. I don't think these are actually numbered in any particular order, although Mark Dever did provide a suggested reading plan to read them in this order. So that's what we're doing. So we sat down, and everybody in the group preaches at some level. Some of the guys are new to preaching. They preach just once in a while. Some people have itinerant ministries where they travel around and preach. Some people preach like me every week in their pulpits. And so we just sat down and we started working through this 4-chapter book. Really a simple book, limited to about 100 pages. That's how all these books in the series are. And it really dives into an argument for what is expositional preaching. And there's definitions provided, and there's some dangers when it's not expositional preaching provided. And in 4 quick chapters, you get a really good overview of what it is and maybe how to avoid the dangers and how to do things well. It's not as practical as some of the other preaching books. It's not as much of a how-to. It's a little bit more ethereal, and it's a little bit more of this big overview, but for a book this size, what would you expect? We did notice that in 4 chapters, we feel like it may have been helpful to get an additional chapter with just the other nuts and bolts of delivery, maybe some other circumstances that aren't just the preacher who preaches every week in his pulpit. Maybe he travels to some other places, or maybe is asked to do some topical preaching from time to time, or maybe is asked to do some different things. Maybe there was a little room to sort of dig into that, but otherwise we thought this was an excellent introduction with some very helpful takeaways and tools, some great drawings in here. One of the brothers really said, this particular chart is very helpful. And I thought that was really good. I'll tell you where I feel like the money is with this book. I mean, I actually took and wrote this down in a notebook so I could carry it with me, but that is this appendix in the back called Questions That Preachers Ask. And really what it does is it sort of helps you to assess your sermons and your preaching and where you're at. Like, am I hitting the right parts of exegesis, structure, application, illustration, theological reflection? Really just a helpful guide. I feel like the biggest takeaway of this book is the appendix. I do feel like David Helm, if maybe he didn't have the restrictions of the page count, could have really greatly expanded on this book and made it even more helpful than it already is, but it does seem like sort of the theme of these are just a quick one-off read. I would also suggest that I would love to have the people who sit in the pews where I preach, at the church where I preach, read this book and understand what they should be holding me accountable to in expositional preaching. Another one of the brothers that I'm reading this is just good for even a Bible study or helping a Sunday school teacher because it really is just really good principles on good preaching and good teaching. Some other folks have recommended the book, so I'm recommending it, but also Matt Chandler, Mark Dever, and Kent Hughes. By the way, Matt Chandler said, David Helm has written the most helpful, concise, and useful book on expositional preaching I have ever read. Now, I can't speak to how many preaching books Matt Chandler has read, but there are many of them out there, and he's saying pretty substantial things about this one. I thought this one was really good. I think it's a really good introductory overview. If you're just looking to sharpen the saw a little bit, if you're looking for a good refresh, just refresh, reboot, you're just thinking through your preaching, really good. Or if you're thinking about a book club where you don't want to read too much, but you want to connect with some other brothers or other pastors, man, this is a good stack for that very thing. We're all busy, and to be limited to 100 pages, and actually 100 small pages at that, pretty good option for that. Now, I don't want to leave you without other options. There's another book, also with a foreword by Mark Dever, that just recently came out called From and Before God, A Practical Introduction to Expository Preaching by Suhail Michelin, and he actually refers to David Helm's book in this and some of the same discussion pieces. This, I think, is a 250-page expanded version of this in many ways. So if you're looking for something bigger, you want something more practical, then From and Before God is probably for you. If you were looking for just a broad overview, then the book that comes out of the Building Healthy Churches book is probably right. I also want to just suggest that I love that Mark puts this forward. Mark Dever says, this is really necessary to get this right, because as the church is hearing God's word preached week in and week out, then hopefully a lot of these other things are starting to come into play correctly. So I know from Mark Dever's approach and the 9 marks of a healthy church, and really his heart and his attitude, he is suggesting that you really got to get this one right, and so that's why we started with this one. It's my hope to do additional reviews and maybe recommendations as we continue reading those, so subscribe to the channel or follow us on SaltyBeliever.com and just keep up with how we hear and read and assess the other books.